Very pleasant good morning to you guys. This is where we come to the Anansi's web education. We deal with the education of all information of African history, the villages and how they came about, all the information you need to know. And as usual, we have with us the former president, some say different, still president, but he's a former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. No stranger, absolutely no stranger to you guys. David Arthur Granger. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Good morning, Mark. Good to be back on the program.
And good to have you back on the program. I hope you got uh, some rest after celebrating your birthday and so forth and so on. Hope you enjoyed everything.
I did. Thank you.
Today's topic, we want to touch on what were the causes of the transatlantic trade and captive Africans. Those are important things we want to touch on, and which were the most prosperous but most notorious slave trading states, and who were the victims of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans. And then the final would be, why do the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic trade in present day Guyana would want to talk and get a little bit knowledge on reparation and how important that is. Reparation, how important it is. Um, Again, good morning to all of you. Good morning. With us again is our former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And our first question and first topic for discussion is, what were the causes of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans? Can we start
Well,
there,
this
please?
is, this is the best place to start. And you've raised four very important points. It's a heavy agenda for this program, but let's get into it right away. Well, when we talk about causes, it is difficult to pin down one cause. There are multiple causes, of course. The big issue is that the trade came about because I don't want to go too far back in history, but the Moors, the African black-skinned people from North Africa, invaded the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, um, around 711 in the 8th century, and they occupied the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 800 years until the Christians drove them out. Of course, the Moors were Muslims. And when they went there, they carried many of the tropical products that we think, are characteristic of the Spanish economy. And one important crop they carried was sugar cane, which the Muslims had brought all the way from what is now Iran, then Persia. And the Portuguese and the Spaniards introduced it in the Atlantic Islands, in Madeira, which is a Portuguese territory at that time. In fact, the Portuguese who came here are actually Madeirans. They didn't come from mainland Portugal, and the Spanish Canaries. So the transatlantic trade started with the cultivation of sugar, and that was taken by the Moors into Madeira and the Canaries. But at the same time, there was a lot of exploration because the Moors also introduced modern sailing techniques, use of the compass and use of the sails and construction of ships. So these states were geographically positioned to explore the Atlantic. And as early as 1441, Portuguese explorers went along the coast of West Africa searching for sources of gold. And in 1441, a Portuguese captain called Gonzalez actually captured Africans and took them back to Portugal. And they started to use Africans as labor to produce sugar. Then from the Canary Islands and continental Spain, sugar cultivation was taken by the Portuguese to uh, San Tome, which is in the Bight of Benin in West Africa. So what we had is a marriage of sugarcane cultivation and shipping with African labor. And in 1500, I'm sorry about the history, in 1500, a Portuguese called Cabral sailed across the Atlantic and discovered Brazil, and he took sugarcane cultivation to Brazil. So from the Arabs to the Iberian Peninsula to the Canaries and and Madeira to São Paulo, São Tome, and then to Brazil. So the cause was the marriage of sugar cultivation with labor and the establishment of plantations. This brought about a shift in the economy from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And after that, the other Atlantic states like Britain, France, Denmark, and the Netherlands joined the trade. So the cause was really the search for gold in the first instance, and secondly, the need to produce sugar, which was a highly priced commodity, which was used by only the elite classes at that time. So it was in pursuit of profit in sugarcane cultivation that the marriage of African labor with this crop um, became implanted first in West Africa and then in Brazil, and later on it spread, particularly by the Dutch to Guyana. Of course, Guyana was a Dutch colony. There are three Dutch colonies, Demerara, Essequibo, Berbice, and later on to Barbados and other countries. So when the Dutch were expelled from Brazil by the Portuguese, they brought the enslaved labor and the sugarcane and implanted it in Guyana. So that was the start of the transatlantic trade. That the more they needed to produce sugar, the more captives were needed to work as laborers on the plantation. So what started as a trickle became a torrent um, over the years. So instead of capturing, a few dozen, they started to capture people by hundreds and build ships to move them across the Atlantic. So that was the start of it. The sugar cultivation and the Portuguese, you should bear in mind, again, I'm sorry about this history, the Pope divided the so-called New World between Spain and Portugal. So he drew a line in what is called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and all of the territories to the east of that line were awarded to Portugal. That is why countries like Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau um, became Portuguese territories because the Pope drew that line. And the territories to the west of the line, Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, Cuba, are Spanish. It came because of the poor Pope's ruling to divide the New World in two. Of course, later on, the British and the French tried to capture territories from those two Catholic countries. But it all came about because they were Atlantic states and they were the first explorers in the Atlantic.
All right, good day. If you're now joining us, it's Anansi Web Education. My name is Mark Benchap. With me is the former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Arthur Granger. Over the years, we've been hearing, and I'm glad that you broke it down in terms of the start of the genesis of the slave trade. And we were hearing oftentimes people would say, your own folks out in Africa were just capturing you guys and selling you guys, sending you guys away. I'm sure you heard that as well. Add a little bit info on that, please.
There is some truth in it, but I insist that, to the best of my knowledge as a student of history, the removal of Africans started with Portuguese capture and enslavement. Later on, they were able to uh, use African go-betweens because they never went far inland, and they set up these factories. Well, it comes from a Portuguese word, Victoria, but they set up these factories along the coast, and people would bring these captives to these barracoons or to these stations or factories, and they would be put on board ships. They would be enslaved. So there had to be some degree of collaboration by African chiefs. But after a while, the European countries started to encourage the chiefs by providing weapons and offering inducements, so that if they brought captives, they would be paid in some form of metal or cloth and other things that they needed. So it wasn't a one-sided trade. Certainly, it was two-sided, but the initiative came from the European countries, and after a while, they were able to get African countries which were not at war with each other to start wars in order to get captives. And quite frankly, I don't think many of the African states knew what was happening to the captives. They were going to war and capturing people, but they didn't know that they were coming across the ocean, and they were going to be involved in plantation labor.
So they were obviously lied to about the purpose of getting these, you know, Africans, whether young, middle-aged, or up the hill. They
No, they
didn't.
wanted them young. They wanted them young. The traders, the European traders, wanted them young because, um, uh, as I said, even before Columbus came here in 1492, came to the Bahamas in 1492, sugar cultivation had started, and they wanted laborers rather than women and children, and rather than old people. In fact, Professor Thompson has pointed out that in the heyday of slavery, a slave only lived for about 12 years on average because they were worked to death. It wasn't a happy existence. They were treated as two-legged domestic animals. But the victims of warfare, or the people who captured them on the West African coast, weren't aware of what was taking place on the other side of the ocean.
All right. Thank you much for that. And moving on, we want to touch on the uh, which were the most prosperous but most notorious slave trading states.
Well, the states which had access to the Atlantic, because it was a maritime trade largely. And the Dutch were a great shipping nation. Britain was a great shipping nation as well. Portugal and Spain led the way because they were conquered by the Moors, who introduced new technologies um, in terms of oceanic travel. It wasn't easy. People were afraid to go out of sight of land. But because of Arab and African inventions, they were able to use the compasses. They were able to use, you know, better sails and better construction of the boats in order to undertake oceanic travel. And for a long time, in fact, there was one Portuguese king who was called Prince Henry the Navigator because of his commitment. And they sailed not only along the West African coast, but all the way to the Cape of Good Hope. And they went to the East Indies, which, as I said, was awarded to them by the Pope. And you find that Portuguese were able to establish colonies in India at a place called Goa, and as far east as China at Macau. And of course, we had places like East Timor and so on. All these were Portuguese territories. And similarly, to the west of the line of the Tordesillas, you had the Spanish territories. So the most prosperous and equally the most notorious were the maritime states: Britain, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Portugal, and Spain. And later on, of course, the United States got involved in the trade. And you must bear in mind that the manufactured goods in Europe um, were put on board these ships and brought to Africa and exchanged for the captives. And of course, particularly guns, because the guns were used to make the West African tribes more warlike and, of course, more murderous, because at that time the West Africans didn't produce their own guns. So it was the geographical location of those seven countries with access to the Atlantic which made them prosperous. And if you look at the world today, you see they did become more rapidly industrialized, and they did become richer because they were sucking the blood out of West Africa. So their prosperity was based on our poverty. We were impoverished to make them rich.
And as we move on now, who were the victims of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans? And this is important to a lot of people, and especially people who don't understand the trade, the slave trades, and how it affected Africans. We want to hear this here. Who were the victims of the transatlantic trade in captive Africans?
Well, there were numerous peoples along the West African coast. The first captives were taken in what is now Senegal, but during the trade, um, the Europeans divided the coast into several trading zones. For example, what is now Nigeria was called the Slave Coast. What is now Ghana was called the Gold Coast. What is now Cote d'Ivoire is called the Ivory Coast. So, it meant that those areas were famous for the extraction of particular commodities and slaves as well. But further inland, you had large empires. For example, the Asante Empire started off by being inland. The Oyo Empire was inland, and the Yoruba and these other people were inland. They were not coastal states, but it was because of the demand by the Europeans uh, for more captives that they were finally sucked um, out of the hinterland onto the coast. Now, who came? It is difficult to trace the ethnic origins of all of the peoples who came. And what we know is that because of the system of factories, of barracoons, many of the captives who were brought to the British colonies were of Akan descent. Uh, you know, what used to be called incorrectly Coromantee, but Coromantee was just the slave trading station on the coast. But many of the practices that we still preserve in countries like Jamaica and Guyana are traceable to the Akan people, what people call the Ashanti people. Certainly, we know that on West Demerara, there were some people who descended from the Oyo Empire or somewhere Yoruba. Further south, which is now in DRC, a lot of the captives were taken to Brazil. So many of the Africans who were taken to Brazil might be of might be descended from the people from the Congo. So it's a mix, and of course, people were indiscriminate. They didn't have a common language. They didn't come from a single area. And unscrupulous captains would take captives from any part of the coast. And of course, there were wars among the Dutch and the Swedes and the British to get the most captives. But certainly, the whole coast between Senegal and Angola was divided up among those 6 or 7 countries, and it's a mix. And that is why in Guyana we developed a form of Creole speech, which helped people from one group to understand one another. We know for sure that in the Berbice Revolt of 1763, the leader had a name which is associated with the Akan people, Kofi, which is a day name. And there were others who, like Akabre and Atta. So we can only trace these names. But then again, the enslaved Africans did not write their own history. So you don't know what they were called or why they were called a particular name. Because some people were given names almost like fun. A some would be called by the names of planets like Mars or Jupiter or Venus, almost the way you would name an animal. This, and it's difficult to trace a person whose name is Mars or Jupiter because it's not a name that is known in West Africa. So, who were the victims? The victims were mostly young males, and of course, this had problems for reproduction. So, during the period of enslavement, it was necessary to bring more and more because a slave only lived for about 12 years or so, and because of cruel treatment and disease. And they kept on bringing males, and of course, this created a social problem. It was not until after 1807, when the trade was stopped, that people tried to encourage breeding. That is to get enough women to produce more slaves, because of course you couldn't get more replenishment through trading. It is very confusing picture, and it is confused a little later on because after 1807, the trade was stopped, and some people were captured on the high seas and brought to Guyana and other countries as free persons. Some, for example, were crew from KRU, from what is now Sierra Leone. And of course, Sierra Leone itself was set up but not a state, as a settlement. It was set up as a settlement for persons who had been freed from the Western Hemisphere. So it's a difficult task to unravel all of the ethnic groups that were brought here, but predominantly in Jamaica and Guyana, we know from language and features that the Akan people were the most significant numerically. And to some extent, I think in Suriname as well, where some went into the bush as Maroons and became what is called Bosnegers, Bush Negroes. And they were very rebellious, and some of them just refused to submit. But on another occasion, we could look at a more detailed ethnic map. I don't know if there is such an ethnic map, because the empires that were set up between Senegal and the Congo were numerous, and many of them were involved at some stage or other in the transatlantic trade.
All right, well put. You mentioned the word Cromarty, because I know on the quarantine, of which you should be familiar with, after Philippi comes Cromarty. Is there any connection there with that village, Cromarty? Because
No, I think that might have a Scottish origin.
Scottish.
But the name of a station in what in modern day Ghana is called Coromantine. Coromantine.
Quarantine.
Yeah, Coromantine. I think they're two different names. Cromarty is probably Scottish. because this Scottish overseers and plantation owners proliferated in what is now Region 6.
So we get a Coromantee, which a lot of people might say it sounds like quarantine, Coromantee,
No, no,
Coromantee,
I,
quarantine,
quarantine is definitely indigenous name, quarantine.
quarantine,
Mm.
Coromantee, Cromarty. Oh, we gotta really get information out there specifically for young people and for not so young people as well, because it is good to know our history. Uh, so the final topic we're going to be dealing with today is, why do the descendants of the victims of the transatlantic trade in present day Guyana deserve reparations? And again, I repeat, why do they deserve reparations? We hear all over now they're talking, the EU is talking about reparations, the Dutch have apologized, and so forth and so on. Why? Why transatlantic trade in present day Guyana deserve reparations, Mr. Granger?
It's it is not novel, but we must admit that the world is becoming more civilized, if you want to call it that. There was a time of greater barbarism. Um, there was a time of whipping in schools. It was legitimate for a schoolmaster to carry a cane and beat children who were delinquent. In prisons, they had a punishment, the cat o' nine tails, um, uh, up to the 1950s or so. And we used to have executions in Guyana. All of these punishments are regarded as cruel and inhuman. Now, I think it's because of new thinking that people looking back on the damage which has been caused by enslavement, that they came to the conclusion that, as I said, the conference in Durban, South Africa, only occurred, a little over 20 years ago. And it was because of this new humanitarian outlook that they came to the conclusion that, look, this was a terrible crime. And look, we can see the effects. We can see the consequences in our countries. Why is it that Antigua or Grenada or St. Lucia are so poor? And why is it that Black people in Colombia or Ecuador or Brazil are so poor? I mean, you'll be surprised. I was very surprised some years ago to see a picture of the Ecuador football team. And, it's like 9 out of 11 Black people. But many of them are confined to, entertainment and sport. They do not share in the economy. And I can say the same for indigenous people. So it is quite obvious that the victims of the trade have been disadvantaged. And this is an era, this is an age in which it is necessary to rectify. There needs to be rectification of that historical wrong, of that inhumane system. And it is because of that thinking. There were times when people were branded um, uh, by the slave traders. And some were branded with the royal insignia, showing that they were the property of King Charles. People don't do that anymore. And we have to go back to what happened in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter, with the murder of um, of that
Floyd.
American
Floyd.
Floyd, yeah, George Floyd, and so that the world suddenly woke up to this inhumane treatment of a citizen in a so-called civilized state. And the movement spread, even though he didn't lead it. The world suddenly awoke to this great inhumanity, and there were protests in Belgium, protests in Britain, protests in Colombia, and all I can say is that people started to realize that the reason for the disadvantageous treatment of Africans up to the present day, for the discrimination and the impoverishment, is not that they're stupid. It's just that the system that they inherited from the period of enslavement kept them in those conditions. What we're looking at now is a means of liberating, maybe a second emancipation, a means of liberating the descendants of the victims from the effects of enslavement. And that is why reparations are needed. And that is why in Guyana we must support the Caribbean project, the 10-point RJP, Reparatory Justice Program, so that we could move the African people up to a level of education and science and other forms of cultural development. And that is why we need this international decade for people of African descent. And we will deal with this on a future program of Anansi. But it is not a joke. People have been disadvantaged because of these historical impediments. And that is why Caribbean states, and that's why Guyana must take the question of reparatory justice seriously. We must have reparations if we are to have a good life, if we are to have equality in the Caribbean and in Guyana. Reparations is a necessity, not an option.
Reparation is a necessity, not an option, so said David Arthur Granger. And I don't think any sane person could disagree with that. Reparation is a necessity and not an option. Thank you so much for this week's program, Mr. Granger. Next week we will have some more interesting topic because emancipation, August 1st is it's right around the corner. Reparation should be a big issue. It should be a big issue. Thank you so much, Mr. Granger. Have a great rest of the day and see you next week right here on Anansi Web Education. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our listeners, we will see you guys again next week. Same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM. So long.